Welcome back to Business Talk on businesstech.co.za. Now, if you caught our earlier conversation with Willem Olivier, CEO of Resilient Innovations, you'll know we dug into the human side of resilience and how things like leadership and culture and mindset determine whether a business bends or breaks under pressure. Well, in this follow-up, we're widening that lens a little bit because resilience doesn't live in isolation. It lives in an ecosystem, and it's one that spans your cloud, your data, your partners, your suppliers. And if we're honest, sometimes that one guy in IT still knows where the backup files are. Well, Willem has been building those ecosystems across Africa for more than 2 decades, from his time leading the buyout that created Resilient Innovations from Die Data's continuity practice to helping multinationals plan for the pretty much unplannable. Willem, great to have you back. And I have to say, after our last chat, I found myself reevaluating my own business continuity plan in my studio and seeing what my coffee backup situation is looking like. But in our previous discussion, we spoke about people as the true foundation of resilience, which is appropriate. But today, I want to expand on that. I mean, when you talk about a resilience ecosystem, what does that really mean in practice?
Yeah, hi, good morning, Michael. Thank you for the time today again, and good to see you again. Absolutely. The people, as we mentioned in the previous podcast, it's important and it's a very, very critical component. But that ecosystem does expand to way beyond the people, and it's people that again have to drive all of those ecosystems and put it into one bowl, if I can put it that way, and to make sure that when you have to recover the company, you can recover your organization. And recovery doesn't mean that it's just every time a building that burns down; it's other things as well. And what you got to think about, it's people, it's culture, leadership, governance, processes and systems, supply chain. It's just it's a huge and massive project that you have to go through to make sure that you can recover your infrastructure at the end of the day. Now, if you look at, for instance, a supply chain issue, if it is product that you get from China or America or Europe, and you got to put that into your manufacturing processes to build a car, for instance, and you can't get hold of a specific component, it then impacts your JIT, your just-in-time program on your production line. So that is one of the components in that whole ecosystem that has failed. So you got to think about what are those things you got to do. And I must say that the motor manufacturing industry has been very, very good with dealing with these things and making sure that those programs do work well. And if you look at other companies that do a lot of manufacturing, and it's also JIT-based operations, they plan well. They plan well, and that is what is a good example for companies that have to look at the full ecosystem of your recovery if something goes wrong.
Yeah, when I hear you talking about ecosystems that way, I'm a budding overlander, so I've just got myself a 76 Land Cruiser, and you've got to think, well, I've got the max tracks, I've got I've got the recovery winches, I've got the high lift jack, I've got all of these things. And if one of them fails, if you're in a situation, say you've got everything, but it's the high lift jack that doesn't work, well, then you might as well have none of them. And from what you're saying, it is this tightly woven web of you've got clients, suppliers, service providers. How does that interconnectedness shape the strength or the fragility of the overall resilience ecosystem? Because you're only as strong as your weakest vendor.
Absolutely. Yeah, and it's you got to understand what are your strengths and your weaknesses and your capabilities when you start going through these things to make sure that you can deliver in your ecosystem. And again, that's now where you start looking at all of your dependencies that you have in your organization. And like you say, you've got that lift that you depend on that thing, and now it's broken or it's not in the car and you're stuck somewhere in the sand. So understanding your dependencies and also the dependencies your suppliers have on other companies that supply them. So what are their dependencies? Because we become such an interconnected world, and people that have to deliver products and services that are massively interconnected, because with cloud as well, it's become where people are saying, well, we are so everything's in the cloud nowadays, no hassle at all, we sort of be backed up and whatever. But we saw last week what happened with two of the big multinationals that are cloud service providers that had massive outages, and that impacted many people, many companies all over the world. It impacted airlines and various other organizations. So to understand what those dependencies are and what are those strengths and weaknesses of these people, and maybe to say, well, I don't want to be dependent on just one company to provide a service or a product that you require that's 100% outsourced to one individual or company. You got to think about maybe doing, well, let's have 3 of them in place, because that's typically what companies would do. And it's not always possible. I understand that. But you got to think those things through and then look at the risks and try to mitigate them as much as possible.
Yeah, and speaking of those cloud outages, I think the Reserve Bank's flavor of the year risk was third party. To understand your third party risks. So a lot of the banks were trying to understand just how reliant are we on these hyperscalers. The whole world is, sadly, because there are just a handful that are so dominant, but there are ways around it. And if you look at kind of technology seems to be the connective tissue here. You've got cloud, you've got data recovery, you've got connectivity. How do those elements come together to ensure continuity under real world pressure?
Yeah. So I think one of the things that have happened with us as human beings over the last, say, 60, 70 years is that technology has really changed our world. It's thinking about 100 years ago, steam trains were still going, but things have changed massively. We have so much dependency on technology nowadays. And what drives that technology? Data and information is the absolutely critical in this process. And this is what sits in the cloud. This is what sits on your computers. This is what sits on a hard drive somewhere. And this is backed up somewhere. And a cloud is just another computer with a hard drive or a solid state disk inside it that has some data or information that you rely on to deliver your products. So understanding that you got to be able to recover that data is critical. You have to have the ability to switch over to a production system that's in DR somewhere and have access to that data. Now, when we talk about data, a lot of companies would say, "Oh, we make a backup every afternoon. We put it on the hard drive, and the business leader or the CEO takes it and puts it in car, and he drives back home and he puts it in his safe, and then tomorrow he gets another one, and they rotate these disks or whatever the case may be." And that we often see that, and it's not always a very good way to do it, but it does work for some smaller companies, and so be it. But like we saw with the likes of what happened last week, it was really quite bad. So if you had, say, for instance, your production systems in the cloud with one of these multi-scalers, you could have then been able to recover that in a DRAS environment where you would have disaster recovery as a service with, say, a local service provider like ourselves in South Africa. If it's in our capability to do that in terms of having all the right equipment for you, then you could spin up those services, reload the data, and get going again. You can do it fairly quickly. But then that's great. It'll work. But if you have that in DRAS and your systems are synchronized, and if you have, for instance, a cybercrime attack, you've got to be able to switch and to cut those links. But ultimately, to have the last backup is, in my view, critical. The first, second, and third backup. That immutable data where you have a backup as a service as well, where you just basically dump the data. It's immutable. Nobody can change it. Nobody can encrypt it. It can't be stolen. It's very, very difficult because it's air gapped. So that makes a big difference in a company's lives, because if ultimately your production and DR goes down and you don't have it, but you lose your data, you've lost the gold. You probably won't survive that day.
Yeah, I mean, that is the bottom line for any business today. You've worked across regions, but when you look at South Africa specifically, where are our biggest weak spots in resilience at the moment? Is it infrastructure? Is it regulation? Is it more mindset? What would you say are the big weak spots?
I would say that in South Africa, infrastructure has significantly changed because of the reliance on power, and that we've now built generators in every building basically in South Africa the last 10, 15 years. I remember going to business continuity and people couldn't understand, gosh, we had 2 generators in our building here in Midrand and running data centers, and the Jenny start up every week to test, and when the power goes out, we were the last fallback. But that has changed significantly. So from an infrastructure power perspective, yes, that's changed. We've got solar that came in as well. LED lightings, much more efficient data centers that's deals with that. And so I think infrastructure has been great. Technology has become also a little bit more reliable. But yes, we still have infrastructure challenges when it comes to data connectivity. So that's where I would say there's a massive gap to a certain degree on that as well, because we see this, I would say, at least 2 or 3 times a year, where a client calls up and says, listen, the fiber cable has been taken out of the ground or hooked up by some TLB digging in the road. So that I see is a major factor. Then on the people side, I do see that also as a weak point. And the reason for that is because a lot of companies have quite a high churn in people. And it's people are not like 30, 40 years ago where you would start with one company and you would retire at that company and you would have that sort of corporate memory that stays within that organization. People leave with that information or that knowledge that they have and that training that they've received around business continuity on disaster recovery, for instance. So I would think that people does pose quite a high risk. I think that to me is important. And then also, if you also just to come back to the telecommunications, the undersea cables, we've seen those as well. I would say that we experience at least one break every 5 years. I think it might be maybe a little bit longer, but we've seen a few of them happen over the last 10 years. And that then the internet degrades. That's definitely what happens. So if you start requiring, for instance, international links, you also have to look at your, again, supply chain. Your redundancies are these suppliers, and do they have fibers that are running, say, East Coast and West Coast, to make sure that you can reconnect into your international file service that you require. Because if you look at banks, a lot of them here in South Africa, for instance, may have a payment system that sits in Singapore. That's where the centralized systems are, and the people reside there. They may have a call center in India. So your reliance on technology, again, from a telecommunications perspective, is high. And you have to understand.
CCOM, I think, was down in Cape Town for a couple of days. And so, again, there's geopolitical issues that play there with issues that are going on in the Red Sea. So you really have to have something, back to your ecosystem approach, that's holistic, taking into account all of the issues that you've mentioned, because I think given our unique relationship with load shedding and water shortages and cable theft or cables being broken because of poor contracting, I think there are lots of opportunities for improvement, shall we say. Traditionally, though, disaster recovery has been viewed as a cost, maybe a grudge purchase, but forward-looking businesses obviously need to be reframing this as a competitive advantage. So how are you seeing that shift play out among your clients? Because resilience is starting to sound less like an insurance policy and more like a growth strategy from where I'm sitting.
Yeah. So the whole thing about grudge purchases is that we've seen that, and that is changing. Companies do understand a lot more than they did, I would say, 10 years ago, that this is not just a grudge purchase. This is not just a reliance on, or because the central bank has said that we have to do that, or the Reserve Bank has said that we have to do that. So that common sense has really started to get driven into organizations, and especially large organizations. And they have their backup data centers, they have technology that they back up. So there's been a real investment into a lot of large organizations to do this. Now, it's great if you're a big bank or a big mining institute or a financial institute or whatever the case may be, and you a multinational, for instance. So you would have the funds to be able to cater for that. But small to medium enterprises don't necessarily have those funds to go out and say, right, I'm going to buy all of the equipment and duplicate that somewhere else, or have additional business continuity managers or risk managers in my organization. And that's where we come in as an organization, because we also work with companies and the medium enterprises that struggle with these things. And they don't want to necessarily go to a multinational cloud service provider like the hyperscalers, because, again, if they have to extract the data, it becomes extremely expensive to do that. So they would work with people like ourselves to make sure that they can recover the organizations from a DRAS and a BAS perspective. And the cost definitely is a lot better in our environment than what it is to take necessarily international. But yes, we can provide that kind of support to clients, and they outsource it. Our consultants would come in, we do a business continuity program for you, and then we'll train your staff, and then they can run with it themselves. And then next year we could come back and review things for you and then retrain staff again.
And I think dealing with experts increasingly is the way to go, especially when you're dealing with something as sensitive and as critical and core to an organization as its very operations and the ability to continue to transact and exist and serve customers and produce products. And you really can't be taking any shortcuts when it comes to this. Finally, looking ahead, if you, as more businesses see resilience as part of their operating DNA, let's say, not just as a contingency plan, how do you then see the ecosystem evolving in South Africa?
Yeah, it's definitely changed significantly. Over the past 30 years, we've seen it coming from ITDR, the old mainframe stuff, going into business continuity, and now going to more resilience. And that whole ecosystem is definitely expanding more and more. Companies are seeing the importance of it. They are seeing that it is something that they have to deliver. And it is becoming the DNA of a lot of companies to be able to test and to recover their organizations. So I do think that it's not just becoming a grudge purchase, if I can use that word, from a you have to do it because the central bank or the Reserve Bank says you have to do it, or that there's some governance policy in some organization that tells you you've got to do this because this is what it's supposed to be. You've got to have that. We see this more and more with people and companies are saying, guys, we do need this. This is something that will help our organization to recover if something does happen. And we've seen it. We test companies here often with a lot of data. Very interesting in terms of the type of companies that we test. So we know that companies do need to do this. They don't do it for just to comply to whatever they have to do to perform against their KPIs. We can see the technology guys that come into our data centers, work, the tests that they do, the pre-test reports that we set up, the post-test reports we set up for the clients, and we work with them, and we work 24/7. Sometimes we test this up to 2 o'clock on a Saturday morning or 2 o'clock on a Sunday morning. But ultimately, to make sure that the companies can recover that data or systems that they do need to recover. And that I do see is where people are actually very they trust the system. They like to work with it and to make sure that they can recover the organization.
Yeah, well, because I think maybe the companies that thrive in the next decade won't just be the most innovative, they'll be the most resilient in a world that seems to be throwing up more of the geopolitical risks around supply chains, that seems to be throwing up more technology and the speed of technology. But the more you stack technology, the more, let's face it, you raise potential points of failure. And we certainly know South Africa's structural constraints when it comes to infrastructure and maintenance, those don't seem to be going anywhere. So, Willem, great pleasure chatting to you, CEO of Resilient Innovations, and thank you for reminding us that resilience isn't just a function or a department. It's an ecosystem that connects everything from your people all the way up to the cloud. If you missed our first conversation, you can find it on businesstech.co.za, where Willem unpacks the human side of resilience. I think together, these two chats make a powerful blueprint for how South African businesses can build continuity and really last. I'm Michael Avery, and I'd like to remind you that in business, you can't predict the storm, but you can build an ecosystem that thrives through it. Take care.